I was in my early 20s, living just a short drive from Manchester, New Hampshire. Life at that time felt like a haze, an uncertain, restless stretch of days. My 2-year relationship had ended, leaving behind a hollow ache and a lot of unanswered questions. I was adrift, grasping at routines to fill the emptiness. That's when my grandmother stepped in. After my grandfather passed away, her faith became her anchor, and every Sunday she insisted I accompany her to church. Maybe out of love for her, or maybe out of my own need to find something solid to hold on to, I agreed. It was a small church in a tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone. New faces didn't show up often, so the moment I saw her, I noticed. She was sitting near the back, her dark curls catching the sunlight streaming through the stained glass, her hazel eyes scanning the hymnal, like she was searching for something too. There was something about her that pulled at me. When the service ended, I found myself drawn to her, maneuvering through the small crowd just to say hello. She smiled when I introduced myself, a smile that was both warm and guarded, like she had a secret she wasn't ready to share. Her name was Kaylee. She had this quiet way about her, an air of mystery that made her seem both familiar and otherworldly at the same time. We chatted for a while, just surface-level pleasantries, but there was an undeniable spark. When I asked where she was from, she laughed, a soft, melodic sound, and told me I'd have to take her out to dinner to find out. Over the next few Sundays, I pieced together fragments of her story. Her family had moved to town recently, something about trouble involving her stepfather and her biological father. The details were vague, shadowy, but they hinted at a darkness she didn't dwell on. Despite that, she seemed vibrant, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. By the third Sunday, I couldn't resist. After the service, I mustered up the nerve to ask her out. She didn't hesitate. We planned something simple: dinner, a movie, and a drive. I remember being nervous but excited, a feeling I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. That night started off perfect. Dinner was easy and light, filled with laughter and small confessions. At the theater, we sat close enough that our arms brushed, and by the time the credits rolled, I was already planning our next date in my head. The drive afterward was meant to stretch the evening out a little longer, to savor the connection we'd found. We took a winding road through the woods, the kind of road where the trees arch overhead, creating a tunnel of shadows, broken only by the car's headlights. Kaylee was quiet, staring out the window as the world rushed by. Then out of nowhere, she started speaking. At first, I thought she was mumbling something under her breath, but the words were sharp, guttural, a language I didn't recognize. I glanced over at her, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes had rolled back, the whites glowing faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. Her body was rigid, her hands clawing at the air, as if she were trying to ward something off. I pulled the car to the side of the road, my heart pounding. Was she having a seizure? A panic attack? I reached for her shoulder, but before I could touch her, she screamed, a sound that didn't seem human. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. She blinked, her eyes snapping back to normal, but there was no relief in them. They were wide with terror, glistening with unshed tears. Without a word, she unbuckled her seatbelt, threw open the door, and ran. "Kaylee!" I shouted, chasing after her. She disappeared into the trees, her dark hair blending with the shadows until she was gone. I called her name over and over, my voice echoing through the silent woods. But there was no answer. Panicked, I called the police. Search teams combed the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. But they found nothing, no sign of her, not even a footprint. The next day I tried calling her, but her number was disconnected. Her Instagram account had vanished. When I went back to church, no one seemed to know who she was. They looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd imagined her entirely. I asked the pastor, the congregation, anyone who might remember the girl with the dark curls and hazel eyes. Every answer was the same. I don't know who you're talking about. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that night. Sometimes I think about her, the way she laughed, the warmth in her smile, the fear in her eyes before she disappeared. And sometimes when I'm driving alone on a quiet road, I glance into the woods and wonder if she's still out there. In my early 20s, I lived about 30 minutes outside Manchester, New Hampshire, in a small, nondescript town that felt more like a pit stop than a destination. My life at the time mirrored the place, quiet, stagnant, and lost in transition. A recent breakup had left me untethered, and I drifted through my days as if I were sleepwalking. Looking back, I realized I was searching for something, though I didn't know what. Maybe that's why I started going to church with my grandmother. She was a devout woman, the kind who clung to her faith like a lifeline, especially after my grandfather passed away. Every Sunday morning, she'd put on her best dress, her well-worn Bible tucked under her arm, and insist I come along. At first, I went out of obligation to support her in her grief, but over time, I found that the ritual brought a semblance of stability to my otherwise unmoored existence. The church was a small, weathered building, its wooden pews polished by decades of use. The congregation was even smaller, just a handful of families who had been attending for generations. Faces were familiar, names even more so. So when I saw someone new one Sunday morning, she stood out like a shadow on freshly fallen snow. She sat near the back, her posture relaxed but her presence magnetic. Her hair was dark and unruly, a cascade of curls that seemed to have a life of their own, and her eyes, hazel, piercing, and almost unnervingly aware, seemed to absorb everything around her. I couldn't stop glancing in her direction, trying to place her, but I knew I hadn't seen her before. A new face at church was like a comet streaking through the sky, rare and impossible to ignore. After the service, I found myself lingering, waiting for a chance to approach her. When I finally did, I was struck by how easy the conversation flowed. Her name was Kaylee, and she had an air about her that was hard to pin down. Quiet but confident, reserved yet magnetic. There was something almost otherworldly about her, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. We talked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. When I asked about her background, she deflected with a soft laugh, telling me I'd have to take her out if I wanted to know more. There was a playfulness to her that only made her more intriguing. Over the next few Sundays, I learned bits and pieces of her story. She and her family had recently moved to the area, fleeing some vague, troubling circumstances involving her stepfather and her biological father. She didn't go into detail, and I didn't press her. What mattered was the way she seemed to radiate life, despite whatever shadows lurked in her past. By the third Sunday, I couldn't resist. As the congregation filed out, I caught up to her and asked if she'd like to go out sometime. Her answer was immediate and enthusiastic, and we set a date for the following Saturday. A simple evening of dinner, a movie, and a drive. I remember the day vividly. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years, my palms sweating as I double-checked my reflection in the mirror. But the moment I picked her up, the tension melted away. She had a way of putting people at ease, of making the world feel a little less heavy. Dinner was a mix of laughter and easy conversation, and at the theater, our arms brushed just enough to send a thrill through me. By the time we got to the car for the drive, I was already imagining our next date. The road we chose was one I knew well, a winding tree-lined stretch that cut through the woods. It was quiet, the kind of road where you could hear the hum of the engine and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. At first we talked, but soon Kaylee grew quiet, her gaze fixed on the window. I thought she was tired or lost in thought. Then she started mumbling. At first I didn't catch it. I thought she might be talking to herself, but the sounds grew louder, more insistent. They weren't words, not English anyway. The language was harsh, guttural, and completely alien. I glanced over at her, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes had rolled back into her head, leaving only the whites visible. Her hands clutched at the air, her fingers curling as if she were trying to grasp something invisible. She was speaking rapidly, her voice a strange mix of pleading and commanding. I had no idea what was happening. Was she having a seizure? Was it some kind of psychotic break? I pulled the car to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. "Kaylee!" I shouted, but she didn't respond. She just kept speaking, her voice rising and falling in a cadence that made my skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Her eyes snapped back to normal, and for a moment, she looked at me as if she didn't recognize me. Then she bolted. She threw open the car door and ran into the woods. I sat there stunned, before finally scrambling out of the car to chase after her. "Kaylee!" I called, but she didn't stop. Her figure disappeared into the shadows of the trees, swallowed by the darkness. I called the police, my hands trembling as I explained what had happened. They sent search teams, combing the area with flashlights and dogs, but they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest she had ever been there. The next day I tried calling her, but her number was disconnected. Her Instagram account was gone. When I went back to church, no one seemed to remember her. I asked the pastor, the congregation, anyone who might have noticed her. The answers were all the same. Kaylee? I don't think I've met her. It was as if she'd been erased, like a character written in pencil and then wiped clean with an eraser. I couldn't make sense of it. Even now, years later, I still can't. Sometimes, late at night, I think about her. The sound of her laughter, the light in her eyes, the fear that twisted her face before she ran. And sometimes when I'm driving down a quiet road, I catch myself glancing into the woods, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting, watching. It started as an ordinary road trip. My friend Carol and I had planned everything: snacks, playlists, a rotation schedule for driving, all meticulously laid out for our journey from Florida to New Jersey. We were in good spirits that morning, with the sun slanting just right through the windshield, warming the interior of the car as we cruised down the interstate. By mid-morning, it was my turn to drive. Carol lounged in the passenger seat, humming along to the music. The fuel gauge dipped toward empty, and our stomachs grumbled in unison. It was time to stop. A sign loomed ahead advertising a historic tourist town a few miles off the highway. It sounded quaint, maybe a place with charm, where we could stretch our legs, refuel, and grab a bite to eat. We took the exit, following the winding road into what looked like a picture-perfect small town at first glance. But the closer we got, the more the facade cracked. The main street was eerily quiet. No bustling crowds, no hum of activity. Just an oppressive silence broken only by the sound of our tires crunching against loose gravel. The buildings were weathered and worn, their peeling paint and sagging roofs whispering of neglect. An American flag hung limply from a rusted pole, its colors dulled by time. Something about the place felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Carol joked that it looked like the set of an old Western movie, but her laugh was strained, and I could see the unease in her eyes. We pulled into a convenience store, its neon open sign flickering weakly. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. Behind the counter stood a tall woman with dark hair, her face angular and expressionless. Her eyes lingered on us for a moment longer than felt comfortable as we picked out drinks and snacks. When Carol paid, the woman said nothing, not even a perfunctory, "Thank you." Her silence felt like a rebuke. Back outside, I suggested we check out another store across the street. It looked a little brighter, with colorful knickknacks visible through the window. As we entered, my stomach knotted. Behind the counter stood the same woman, or at least it looked like her. Same face, same dark hair, same hollow stare. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder to see if Carol noticed, but she was already browsing a rack of postcards. Summoning some courage, I approached the counter. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "You're fast. Didn't we just see you at the other store?" The woman blinked, her lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice flat and devoid of humor. "Do you have a twin?" I pressed, my pulse quickening. Her expression hardened, and for a second it felt like the air around me grew colder. "No," she said simply, as though the word itself were a warning. I backed away, grabbing Carol by the arm. "We need to go," I whispered. She looked at me, confused, but followed without protest. We crossed back to the first store, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed confirmation, something, anything, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But when we walked inside, the tall woman was gone. Behind the counter stood a different cashier entirely, a short, middle-aged woman with graying hair and a warm smile. I froze. My mouth went dry. "Where's the other woman?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The cashier frowned. "What other woman?" "You know," I stammered. "Tall, dark hair. She was just here." The woman shook her head slowly. "It's just been me all morning." I turned to Carol, hoping she'd back me up, but she only shrugged, her brow furrowed in concern. "Maybe you're tired," she offered gently. I didn't respond. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together an explanation that made sense. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. We left the town shortly after, stopping at a gas station on the edge of the main road. It was deserted when we arrived, its pumps sitting like relics from a forgotten era. Carol joked about it being a ghost town, but even she sounded uneasy. We filled the tank quickly, eager to put the place behind us. As we prepared to leave, the stillness shattered. Cars appeared out of nowhere, pulling into the station as if summoned by an invisible signal. Families stepped out, their movements too synchronized, too deliberate. They didn't speak to each other or to us. Instead, they just stared. Their eyes followed our every move, unblinking and expressionless. It was Carol who finally broke the silence. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. We didn't look back as we sped out of the station, the car's engine roaring in the oppressive quiet. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Finally, Carol admitted what I'd been feeling all along. "Something's not right about this place," she said. "We need to get back on the highway." That's when the van appeared. It was an old minivan, its paint a faded blue and its windshield cracked in a distinctive spiderweb pattern. It passed us once, then again 10 minutes later, heading in the same direction. There was no way it could have looped back around so quickly. Carol checked the GPS, muttering curses under her breath. The app flickered and glitched, the route shifting erratically. We followed its directions blindly, the sense of disorientation growing with each turn. Time seemed to warp, stretching and folding in ways that made no sense. At one point, it felt like we'd been driving in circles for hours, yet the sun barely moved in the sky. When we finally saw the highway, it felt like a lifeline. We merged onto the familiar asphalt, the tension in my chest easing only slightly. Behind us, the van vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened in that town. I've tried to rationalize it, chalk it up to stress, sleep deprivation, or some bizarre coincidence. But none of it fits. The faces, the stares, the way reality itself seemed to shift and bend. It was as though we'd stepped into another world, one where the rules we take for granted no longer applied. I don't know what we encountered that day, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never take another detour like that again.